out there.
I know. So
all right, everybody.
Go ahead.
So we're going to start our short question and answer period, about 10 minutes here. I'm going to get you the mic so that everybody can hear. Just be cognizant of everybody's hearing abilities here. Hatem has his own mic. If we raise our hands, I'll try to get to all of you. We're going to limit it to about 10 minutes. So if anybody has a question for Dr. Bazian, I guess raise your hand.
Yes. Or a statement.
Or a statement, yeah. Okay. And I'll bring the mic to you.
Well, the doctor was kind enough to sit at our table, during break, so we got all our answers answered. All our questions answered. Didn't we, ladies?
Yep.
Oh, there we go. There we go. There's a runner.
Just a simple one. We wondered what country this prince came from in Africa.
Well, it's Fouta Djallon, which was an area right where Senegal would be, and to the interior of the area. So it was in the land part of Senegal.
Do you relate in any way to this man because you have a common religion but not a common culture?
Well, I come from a transnational perspective, and meaning that I relate to every story that there is a sense of injustice and there is a desire to rectify the wrong. So in this sense, I identify with his story as a normative story of injustice and also perseverance and overcoming great odds.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Not because of his particular religion, even though I am Muslim, is for me the entry into identification is the state of injustice that is there, and therefore that's for me is the resilient part that I identify with.
Can you explain that many Muslims are coming to the United States now, and what is the purpose? Why are they coming here?
Well, from the news point of view, they're coming to threaten our country. The only reason, the primary reason that they're coming to this country is because they see that this is a place where they could find safety and security. There are people that are coming in here because there's a lot of jobs. I don't know if you've made it to the Silicon Valley. It's the United Nations.
Oh, God, yes.
We can't keep up with the H-1 visas that we're giving to highly trained technical employees that are keeping our technology sector running. But also, you have to say, wherever the U.S. foreign policy is entangled, the end result is that we receive and we open the door for immigration. So there is an aspect of U.S. foreign policy that is driving certain immigration to the United States.
So which people come? Like if you go to another country, only certain people can come, not anybody wants to.
Well, there are a number of various people that come. One is that if you are in the technology sector, that's one group that we are actually recruiting. You know, headhunters go and recruit across many parts of the world, Muslims and otherwise. Second, there are places where there is disorientation in the economy. For example, in many parts of the Muslim world, the particular type of privatization, particular type of market economy that is really distorted, resulted in a mass migration from the rural areas to urban centers, and then from urban centers to Europe and to the United States. This would be similar to what is taking place in migration from Mexico and Latin America. The North American Free Trade Agreement have been a disaster for many of the Mexicans and Latin Americans who are in the rural areas, in the farms. The emergence of agribusiness, changing the rules relative to lands, resulted in mass migration from the rural areas to urban centers, then from urban centers across the border. So that's why you see in terms of the Latin American Mexican immigration tend to be more of a rural phenomena, and similar parts of in the Muslim world. Third category would be war refugees. So for example, I said Syrians, Iraqis, Somalis, Libyans, Palestinians, Afghan, all these, as well as Iranians, beginning in 79, all these are refugees as a result of civil wars, regional conflicts, and engagements in there that resulted in massive immigration.
But a lot of people like to come, but these people how do they get the money or whatever it needs to take to get here compared to the other ones who would like to come in there?
Well, the thing is that if you want to make it, right, literally it does not cost $100,000 to make it. You could essentially, for example, thinking about the Palestinians. You most likely would leave from Iraq. You were on the border between Iraq and Jordan as a result of the war. There were about 3 Palestinian refugee camps of Palestinians who lived in Baghdad, in Basra, and Mosul. They were at the borders. The U.S. decided to relocate this large Palestinian population to the U.S. as it ended its occupation. So the U.S. actually provided the funding for their relocation, and 500 U.S. cities applied for grants to the U.S. government to host these refugees in various parts around the country. For cities, they were looking at the opportunity to make 50 cents on the dollar. So 50 cents goes to direct aid to the refugee, and 50 cents goes to the pocket of the city that use them for libraries, for lights, or for entertaining the guests of the mayor. Right? So that grant process made it possible for these refugees with limited cost. Others, on the other, might be able to save or lean on their cousins or uncle or have contacts that they managed to get $1,500 for a plane ticket. Or if you're good with the internet and you can bear, hotwire.com, where you could have 6 stops and make it to the U.S. with $800 ticket. And then once you land in the U.S., you just say, I don't have any passport. I am asking or seeking refugee status or political asylum. So there are many mechanisms. It's not that expensive, despite possibly the barriers that are there. You could make it in here. You could make it to the U.S. Not that I am involved in the business, but for $1,500, you could make it to the U.S. and then you find ways to adjust and begin your journey into this country.
I'm sorry, I did have another question, but I'd like to address what you've been saying. First of all, I don't think the U.S. should be the top cop of the world. And
I didn't say they are. I just said, as a matter of fact, of what's happening.
No, but what I think there's a group that you haven't mentioned, and that would be the people who acted as interpreters, who were liaison people, and then when the unfriendly government surges in again, the Americans want to protect their helpers, and that is a large component of the people who come immediately.
Yeah, I call them contractors. So these are contractors that the U.S. takes with them. They could be interpreters, they could be cooks, they could be a variety of jobs, similar to what happened during the war in Vietnam. All those who were working with the U.S. are taken because from the local population, they see them as helping an occupation rather than helping the population there. You could have your own, what you call, interpretation of it, but that's some of the realities that took place.
Actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is, in the book, I thought it was very interesting that some of the slaves that had a Muslim background seemed to gravitate to the Baptist faith. That's what it stated, even more so than like Methodist. And I find that interesting because the Baptist, the little bit that I know, I'm not a Baptist, but the little bit that I know, it seems to be so conservative. And yet I know that the Muslim faith can also be conservative. So it's a 2-part question. That's my first question. The second question is, can you just give us a little bit of background information on African American Muslims? I lived in Philadelphia for many years, and there were quite a few in Philadelphia. And after reading this, I always thought that they converted, and I've actually had people tell me that it's a different form of Islam, and now I wonder if it is, and what is the level of conversion versus maybe African Americans that have carried on their Islam, maybe with not really making it that well known?
I think conversion into the Baptists might have similarities in relations to conservatism and in terms of the particular type of structure that the Baptist Church took in the South. But I think more research is needed. I don't think it was a very short piece in there. It needs more research to identify whether was that normative or was that a particular locale in there. So that's something that needs to be looked upon. As far as African Americans' history, actually African American Muslim history, you could see that the early Muslim heritage from the States was not transmitted in any way. What was left is vestiges of memory and identity markers, and that's what Sylviane Diouf mentions in her book. As we enter into the late part of the 19th century and early 20th century, there was a mass, you could say, mobile movement within the African Americans to rediscover and reassert a particular type of identity. And there was major debates taking place with Du Bois being there, Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington. All were grappling with what is the heritage and the identity of African Americans. How should we move forward? What are the methodologies and the approaches? In the mix also was a re-entry of Islam into African American consciousness. And in that entry, there was a discussion that Islam is the lost religion of the African man. That identification becomes part of this trajectory that enters into the early 20th century, and African Americans begin to organize and convert to Islam, as well as some who are seeking to return to Africa. So you have actually a whole return to Africa that occurs at that particular time. From that, you get the progression of the development of the Nation of Islam taking place. Next to it was already a universal Sunni Muslim presence within the inner city of African Americans, but the Nation of Islam actually took on a much more robust presence for a particular reasons. One, between the late 19th century and early part of 20th century, there were a large number of lynchings that were taking place. Some put the numbers of lynching at about 6,000 lynchings occurring. That resulted in one of the responses to it is thinking and identifying the Nation of Islam as a response to the racial attitude. And I often argue that what the Nation of Islam did is it took the racial paradigm and flipped it upside down. Because the racial paradigm said that the African Americans are the curse of God. The Nation of Islam just flipped it, said we are godlike and you're the blue-eyed devil. Right? So in essence, it was a social, political response to the racial attitude and paradigm, as well as asserting a particular notion of development for the African Americans, self-reliance, you could say a particular type of African American capitalism, and that should be seen as part of a whole civil rights movement that was emerging post the Great Depression, that gives birth to multiple possibilities, including Martin Luther King as one, but Malcolm X is really the prince of the Nation of Islam, but also as he shifts to Orthodox Islam, becomes an important figure in this transition toward Islam in the African American community. It's the institutional failure of America to deal with African Americans post-slavery that results in African Americans seeking their relinking with Africa as a way to crystallize their identity, and Islam becomes part and parcel of this attempt to redefine themselves and assert a different identity in the mix of hostility and negation. Now, one of the primary signs in probation or in somehow connected to that. That process results in Islam, once again, if you're sitting in jail, You have been stopped. I had actually one of my son's friends, he just visited his relative, and his relative in 1 week was stopped 76 times by the police in 1 week.
What city?
I'm trying, not in here, I think he's in either in Mississippi or another place, but I don't want to quote, but that's the story of my son's friend who narrated what happened to him during the summer, visiting his relative 76 times. Right? Is driving while you're black is still the fact. So if you made it to jail, basically you are at the edge and the complete margins of the society, and Islam becomes a way for you to reconstitute and re-emerge as a whole, that gives you a purpose, that gives you a worldview, and gives you the ability to really think as a person that has an identity, that has a dignity, and is connected to a broader Muslim community in Africa and other places. That's been the primary aspect of the conversion to Islam among the African Americans. About 30% of Muslims in the US are African Americans. So Philadelphia is one of the major sites, Pittsburgh, Connecticut, Ohio. You go down also to New Orleans, in, let's say, New York, Albany, in Detroit, in Chicago. Those are areas where there is a tremendous increase, a large increase of African American Muslim population. The interesting part is that the industrial belt, where the African American migration during the Reconstruction to the industrial belt cities, where they faced actually tremendous racism in an area where they actually were hoping that there would be accommodation and acceptance, that were the sites where large number of conversion to Islam occurred, not in the South. Actually, the South is still one of the primary areas where the church, in particular Southern Baptists, continue to have sway over large segments of the African American community. So there's an intertwining of the story of present history of Islam among the African Americans and the story of America itself, post-slavery as well as pre-slavery.
And Muslims that come here from other parts of the world, do they blend in with African American Muslims? I mean, will they go to the same mosque? Do they see it as their same Islam if they're coming from Pakistan or Iran or?
Yes and no. There are places where the location makes these possibilities occur, but also we need to accept the fact that one of the major contribution of our modernity and our contribution as America in relations to media production, that we made racism a universal and a global phenomenon. So in essence, you have somebody that comes from Pakistan or China whom they have never met an African American or a black person in person, but as soon as they land in America, their immediate reaction is that they react with a racial attitude, because they have consumed so much of our media production that have already crystallized a stereotypical racist paradigm that operates. So as such, these are things that have to be worked on and have to be really demolished, because from my perspective, these are another form of idol worshipping, because you're putting yourself in the ideal I versus the other, who is another human being that is equal to you. And I think that's where the battle has to be fought, in really demolishing this racism and racial attitude. And religious institutions have a fundamental responsibility in doing so, knowing that the market is not going to do it because they make money out of otherization of different people. So for me, religious institutions have a major responsibility.
So what you're saying is it is kind of segregated. I mean, you'll have mosques.
Not in the same ways. It's like you don't have, let's say, this is an African American mosque, but what you have is, because there are certain areas in terms of where people are living, is segregated on the basis, contours of geography, right, that impacts. And then the second is the already preformed racial attitudes, also likewise makes the possibility of crossing these racial boundaries much more difficult to come by.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Can I ask?
We got one more?
One more, 2 more minutes.
Can I
Two more.
just say this? To me, this line has been blurred between
the newest influx of Muslims as compared to black Muslims. And the name that comes to my mind is Louis Farrakhan. And he's a militaristic, anti-white hater. So the Muslims that are coming in now don't want to be identified with him. And so it's always been a question, who are black Muslims? They're not Muslims, they're black Muslims, which are a whole different story.
Well, I don't look at it that way. I think if you want to correctly evaluate and look at Farrakhan, Farrakhan is born out of American conditions,
Yes.
right? He is not an imported entity. He is essentially the history that we don't want to contend or deal with.
Yes.
And as such, he represents possibly the in your face that you need to deal with me. And in this sense is not comfortable, because it's much easier to deal with it under what you call the rug, and not to speak with the issues that he puts out in there. And in that sense, we have to understand that America has not dealt with race issue and still thinks that it did, because we have accepted this notion that we can hold hands and sing "We Are the World," while half of our people are in jail, right? Brown and black. In essence, Farrakhan takes you to task because he doesn't want you to rest. And in this sense, he would appear to us that he is militaristic, even though that he never held a gun himself. But because of the...
He didn't need to.
Huh?
He didn't need to.
I know, but you have to compare it between how many African Americans are being shot on the streets for being black, while no one deals with this in a serious way.
But I'm just saying, as an American who's grown up here,
He's American himself.
yes, but I'm saying he's a black Muslim.
No, he's American that happens to be Muslim.
But I'm saying, if you ask an average American about Farrakhan, they're going to say he's a Muslim. And I'm saying we don't differentiate. So if the new Muslims who are coming over here need to make that clear, because to us, black Muslim, it's a different
No,
entity.
there's a difference in theology and difference idea. I'm dealing here with racial issues, and I'm not dealing with the different types of Muslim. Nation of Islam, they have a different theological belief, different notions.
Okay.
What I'm pointing out that don't evaluate and look at Farrakhan from the lens of his Muslimness, to problematize his message and what he is arguing for. Evaluate him as an African American who happened to have an identity next to his African Americanness that is Muslim.
But all the Muslims here first have an identity too, right? They have a country identity before they have a Muslim identity.
Yes, but at the same time, some of them are pretending to be part of the elite. They exercise a whiteness identity as a way to assert their Muslimness, and as such they feel comfortable in that identity. What Farrakhan asserts is that he wants to challenge the racial attitudes in the society, and that's his message. That he constantly is reminding America of its responsibility that has not been fulfilled.
But he could be a relationship to Abraham, right? As far as a black Muslim hereditary.
Not necessarily. It's not a matter of lineage. It's a matter of what you call a particular...
I theoretically.
A theoretical, he might have lineage to Abdul Rahman, but we don't know.
Okay.
What I want to de-aggregate is that Farrakhan should be studied as part of the history of African American responses and challenges to the racial attitudes in America. And his Muslim identity is an aspect of him, is not the only thing about him. And as such, when you listen to his message, focus on his message as it relates to that long history that continues to be with us, and we refuse to deal with it. The other part is in terms of his Muslim, when he speaks about his Muslim theology and his Muslim perspective, then we could deal with that as it relates to his Muslim theology and Muslim understandings and so on in order to understand where is he coming from on theological issues. I know it's difficult, right? I know it's difficult, but that's what we need to undertake, and we do it for many different groups, right? And we relate to them as such. So when we see somebody who's asserting a particular view, we see that he is from this particular point of view, and we don't try to look at their religious identity as the only way for us to evaluate them. And I think that has to be continuously approached in Farrakhan as well as others.
Excuse me, but you mentioned the man in Mississippi who'd been cited so many times. I have a friend who just came back from visiting her sister in the horse country in Tennessee, and she was horrified. We don't realize in California, it's not typical of a country. There were signs on the lawns saying, "Get the nigger out of the White House."
Oh yeah, no. Have you seen some of the images that were in the protest? You know, various periods about Obama. You know, representing him as Hitler.
Yes.
Yeah. For me, that's just like, how can you just go to? You could disagree with his policies. I definitely disagree with a lot of his policies, but it seems that we found comfort because of his black African American background to cross the racial boundaries in attacking him. Another aspect, and this is something that we need to look at, is often we try to speak that Obama is somehow a closet Muslim, and because of his supposed closet Muslimness, we feel at ease to attack him and to continue to ask for his birth certificate, especially from Donald Trump with his fake hair, asking for a birth certificate for a person that's been elected by America twice. We should ask for the birth certificate for Trump's hair to see if it's authentic. Right? This, for me, this is using a particular identity, right? Meaning his Muslimness, because we're not comfortable with an African American being in the White House and knowing that we can't be out open to say, I don't want somebody of this type to be in the White House. So we use Muslim as a way to attack him. And you could see the increase in racial attitudes post-Obama's election. Also the high rate of purchases of guns after he got elected, as if somewhat like his cousin was, Osama is Obama and so on. So you see some of those characterizations that were there, and I think we need to challenge it for it is. Sometimes it's not comfortable, but that's where education is. You need to be uncomfortable in order to examine your deeply held attitudes. Otherwise, there's no education.
Excuse me, are you saying, you keep talking about this racism, we have to get over, who's racism against who? Who are you talking about?
Well, I think African Americans are racist against whites. No, I'm just joking about this. Racism has to be understood because without a definition, we can't deal. Racism has to be connected to power. African Americans can be prejudiced, but they cannot determine where you live. Racism is about prejudice connected to power to be able to determine where an individual lives, whether they are able to get loans, right? Their net worth. Net worth of an African American, if they sold all their liquid assets today, is about $300 in this country. A white person in this country is $23,000. That for me is the racial gap, and that for me is the result of structural racism that we have to connect. And that for me we have to confront it to be able to begin to deal with the issues that we have in our society.
Have you tried to live in a black neighborhood?
I did, and I continue to live, and I have many.
Well, I tried it, it didn't work out very well.
No, I would say individually we have.
Okay, folks, I think we're going to end it right here.
I think so. It's getting interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Bazian.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. If you could please fill out an evaluation and turn it into the manila envelope on the desk, that'd be great in helping us determine future programs. Thank you again for coming out. You'll have to go down the elevator.